Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Modern Biopharma podcast. I'm Jesse McLaughlin, and today on the show we have Gil Roth. How are you doing today, Gil?
Great, thanks.
Awesome. So Gil is working from home like me. Gil, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about who you are? I don't want to mess it up. You tell us who you are, and then we can start talking a little bit about what you do.
Sure. Well, I'm the president of the Pharma and Biopharma Outsourcing Association, or PBOA. It's a nonprofit trade association that represents contract manufacturing organizations and, well, CMOs and CDMOs as we know them. The D is for development. Um, Basically, I was the editor of Contract Pharma magazine starting from 1999 till the beginning of 2014, where I worked with a lot of CMOs and CDMOs. And over time, I came to realize they really needed some sort of trade association to help them get a collective voice with FDA, Congress, and other regulators and legislators. So I left the magazine at the beginning of 2014, organized the industry into an association, launched PBOA, and we've gone on to have some really good successes and really help the industry mature, which has been important for a sector that's otherwise been, we'll say, fragmented and sort of under the radar. We've really helped raise the profile and get the industry talking, not just to the regulators and legislators, but also to one another. But I could prattle on about that an awful
No,
lot.
that's great. Actually, so I want to ask something about this because I'm always fascinated by people that are in, say, like an organization that's mature and there's, employees and all that, and they go off and start their own thing. And,
Yeah.
From sitting back and looking at it and thinking about how big that that world is, that seems like a pretty big task. So what sort of gave you that to get out of that role that you were in and start something new?
Well, it was really an article that I wrote for the magazine back in the beginning of 2013 about the generic drug user fee amendments, or GDUFA. It was this FDA program with industry that basically industry funds FDA's ability to hire more people so they can review, in this case, generic drug applications. Problem was, it got negotiated without CMOs and it dumped a lot of fees on CMOs.
Mm-hmm.
So the more of them I interviewed, the more of an idea I got that you guys got kind of hosed and you didn't really have representation. Maybe someone should represent you. And they all responded with, "That would be great. You should quit your job and organize us, Gil." I thought, well, and part of that, was, this is 2013 when I first started the ball rolling. You know, trade magazines aren't going to be around forever, was what I thought. And the time was 42 going on 43, and figured, the longer it goes on, it could be not so good for me. So
Right.
this was adjacent to what I was doing. And honestly, it really came to a fore the September of 13, after I held this symposium with a whole bunch of CMOs, told them about the idea, tried to get their feedback, and we had a big dinner afterwards. And I said to one of my friends on the CMO side that um, I was afraid of being a guy, headed into my 50s with a background of print journalism, and a concern that I wouldn't be able to find a gig if magazines started to dry up. And he said, "Gil, your background is not print journalism. Your background is getting us to talk to each other. There's 5 companies sitting at this table right now who would not sit at the same table if it weren't for you. And you help bring us together. Your skill is that, not making articles and schmoozing advertisers." And I thought, well, that's a pretty good way of looking at it. I hadn't approached it in that way. And that's what sort of gave me the idea that, yeah, I should help these guys together, knowing that they have different business models, different, large molecule, small molecule, global multinationals, single facility, the pure play CMOs and the embedded ones like Pfizer or Baxter, that, I could still help bring them together. Maybe egotistically, I felt that, they would trust me to represent them all effectively. But that was really what got it rolling. And, there's that sense of wanting to help a sector that historically has not received a lot of attention and occasionally gotten hosed for that reason. So that was sort of the impetus to start it all.
Yeah, it's a pretty interesting space, and I just got to tell you, I marvel at that change. That's a big change. I think you learned a pretty good lesson there, and we have a picture of who we are and what we do, and the way others perceive us probably isn't always the same. But something that you said there was how sort of disjointed or unconnected this space is. And I do find that interesting. Even my own role, I would say I'm a sales guy calling on places, and say the big guys, the big pharma guys, they seem to be more connected, from a Pfizer to a Gilead to a, you name it, the big name drug companies.
Sure.
People are familiar with each other, but some of these contract pharma companies, short of the big names, are just a facility out in the middle of nowhere, and they're making a drug for somebody and you've never heard of them before. So
Right.
how do you go and connect to these people? Because that's not a small order.
Well, that's part of the first 15 years that was spent, with the magazine. I really got to know a lot of these guys. And even then, I would get surprised by companies I'd never heard of. I still get companies now that, yeah, we've been in the space about 15 years. We kept a low profile. I'm like, I've been here since 1999. I've never heard of you. I'm thankful. I'm glad you want to be part of this. We want to bring them in. But it's that sort of industry specs. There are the multinationals, and there are the quote mom and pops. And part of the thing was, when I had to structure the association, I did it in such a way that when it comes to the dues, the bigger companies pay more, but they don't pay so much more that I don't listen to the little guys, because I've
Mm,
seen that sort of model with other trade associations where they go in for giant amounts of money from the major companies, and the smaller guys are along for the ride. So in this case, I really felt like, partly it's just my sense of wanting to make sure everybody has a voice, and partly it's because it doesn't matter how big a CMO you are, you're tiny compared to pharma. So it's a lot more important, really, when you get down to it.
yeah, that's funny.
There are ways you can measure it. Well, if you measure it certain ways, Humira, that drug from AbbVie, by itself is about 75% of the size of the entire CDMO.
Right.
So, you can have your Catalents and Thermos up here and your other guys down there, but pharma dwarfs everything that we have. So in a sense, we all have to be the underdogs together. And that's
Mm.
what helps us when we're working with FDA, with other industry groups, making sure that everybody understands, just to reward the biggest companies in the sector.
Okay, cool. So something that I've thought of a number of times here over the last 6 months, COVID. I'm so tired of even hearing the word COVID, I have to
Yeah.
say, but we've all heard it, right? And I had a guest on probably 3 months ago now to talk about sort of the outsourcing world, not from like, contract manufacturing per se, but how we've outsourced some of our manufacturing from domestic to international. And, oh, China's making all our drugs,
Sure.
so we don't have access to that. Where do you see that coming into play right now? You have your finger on the pulse of this space. Do you
Sure.
see that happening right now? And do you see major drug companies just pulling it back in and doing it themselves? Or do you really see, in my own view, maybe this CMO space filling that need where they have, capacity and they can start making a lot faster than, some of the traditional pharma
Sure.
companies could?
Well, it's a complicated space. We
Yeah.
did, even before COVID, we did a lot of um, education with Congress. We talked to congressional staff to explain to them how the drug supply chain works, and how manufacturing is not a monolithic term. There's API, there's intermediates, there are dosage forms, there are differences between innovator and generic industry practices. For who PBOA generally represents, our contractors tend to be dosage forms. Some of them are API, but most of them are Western, if not just US or Canadian based. We have a few who operate solely in Europe, but it's really a sector on the dosage form end of things, the Western. It's a thing where the value proposition made sense to go to the Far East. Now, with APIs and intermediates, it certainly is the case that, especially on the generic end, a lot of things moved to China, some moved to India. Even before COVID, though, there was a lot of talk about onshoring and trying things. And during the early days of this administration, driven primarily from an economic perspective, that we need to restore American industry, American jobs, et cetera. Summer before COVID hits, uh, the Democrats really took it in terms of national security.
Hmm.
They started to look at it as what happens if this trade war we're in with China or another one leads to a country like that saying, we're now freezing exports. We're going to stop exporting API to other markets. You will not be able to make drugs anymore. So from the Democrat side, that became more of an interest. I think both sides cared about it in terms of industrial policy, in terms of jobs. But from the Democrat side of things, it was more about national security. We saw that from
Mm.
both the House and the Senate. Um, so that work we had to go down and explain, not explain it away, but explain sort of how the chain works, where things are coming from, why they come from certain areas that they do, and how much work it would take to reconstruct supply chains in a way that would bring, again, those AIs, intermediate starter materials to the US. There are significant reasons, economic, that they moved out of the US. So now in COVID, everybody's concerned again because for a certain stretch, they were worried that exports would be stopped when it looked like the pandemic was going to be primarily in China.
Mm.
Then, when India went into lockdown, that turned into a significant concern for a lot of um, parties that, what if products that are Chinese origin finalized, if dosage forms finalized in India get sent to the US, that stuff isn't coming out anymore. That becomes a supply chain problem. Um, it's, let's see, it's complicated. It will take billions and not 10 years, but potentially, 10 to 20 years to really build industrially in the US the ability to supply our own goods when it comes down to the ingredients, the chemicals, the APIs. Now, the greater question of that is, does pharma want that necessarily?
Hmm.
Because they don't just sell to the US. Large pharma companies have a global market. They sell to multiple regions. They manufacture in different regions throughout the world for various purposes. Some places it's cheaper. Some places it's easier to export to. Higher value things stay in different regions. There's a reason why a lot of biologics work is done primarily in U.S. and Western or North America and Western Europe. Those are higher value. Those are not going to see some great savings from farming them out to the Far East. So there are areas where they stay domestic. There are different types of technologies that stay here or don't stay here. But when you get the double whammy of pharma companies selling to global markets and the current administration announcing that it wants to start driving down drug prices to match those of other regions, some drug companies may not find it um, entirely uh, worthwhile to reconstruct their entire supply chains to manufacture here.
Mm.
So
Right.
still might be cheaper for them or more efficient for them to import from various places and to just keep a robust supply chain. The and I'm prattling on, but this is what I do.
Prattle
Um,
away.
this, this really came up even before the national security thing. It came up with Hurricane Maria a year before that in 2018, I guess, 2017, when the hurricane hit there. There are a lot of pharmaceutical in-house as well as CMO operations in Puerto Rico, and there was no power on the island. There were a lot of issues. Patheon, now owned by Thermo Fisher, um, they were flying in generators, bringing in fuel, first to supply their own facilities, but also to make sure their workers were able to get home, to have decent life, that they weren't just camping out basically at a facility. So at that point, that was a supply chain question, and we talked to FDA and Congress about how the CMO sector was impacted. Even I went into it thinking of solely of CMOs that were operating in Puerto Rico, and I asked all our members, "How were you impacted?" And it turned out a lot of them were companies that were sending things west to Puerto Rico to the customer's facility to get repackaged and shipped away. That product isn't going anywhere. Some of them were getting reagents and other bioprocessing ingredients or components from facilities in Puerto Rico They said, if that stuff stops coming, we stop making biologics unless FDA finds another facility that can
Mm.
provide this stuff, which had to do down the line. So, so it really raised awareness in that respect, that the supply chain isn't simply wide. It also it goes back, and it's not simply, you know, a unidirectional thing where everything is coming, you know, step by step by step. Things go back and forth. Things are used for purposes that are not just for making the dosage forms themselves or the ingredients themselves. So we learned in there are a lot of complexities to the supply chain, and that started us on a concept about to help in case of drug shortages that are manufacturing facility based, and got us in front of a lot of different areas of Congress to talk about um, aspects of the supply and where things are fragile and where things are robust, why it's going to
Mm.
have multiple sources in certain areas.
Oh man, that is a what a subject. I have to say we homeschool our kids. This is
Yeah.
gonna connect, I promise. So we homeschool our kids, and my wife taught an economics class last year to like eighth grade and up, and they all had to read a book called I Pencil. That's what it's called, I Pencil. Anybody that is not really big on economics but wants to understand the complexities of this drug manufacturing process and the supply chain needs to read that book. It will not take you long. And the idea behind it is go make me this pencil, right? Go make me this pencil. And it basically goes, all right, so what do you need to do? Oh, I need this wood. Oh, where are you going to get that wood? You know, and it basically goes all the way back to, you
Yeah.
know, tractors mining the thing to make the graphite. And then you're like, oh, how do you make the tractors, right? And if you really, you know, follow that rabbit hole, it gets pretty daunting. And you, you know, think about how complicated drugs are and all the materials that we need. I mean, it's crazy. And to just think, oh yeah, well, we'll just bring that factory, plop it over here, which
Yeah.
by its nature is not easy in the first place. To
Right.
think that that's going to solve our problems, it doesn't. It's just it's just another level that's now on shore. So it's
Well, it also
you
comes
seem to
up.
understand that. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's come up in relation to COVID, definitely, because, you know, everybody fixated early on how are we going to make enough of this vaccine. And I would
Hmm.
see like a press release from J&J, for example. J&J commits to 1 billion doses, or J&J secures capacity for 1 billion
Right.
doses of vaccine. I'm like, you secured that capacity from my guys. You know, you had to go talk to CMOs. You don't have that internally. And that was the first area they were concerned with. How are we going to make the doses? Then where are we going to get the pharmaceutical glass for syringes? Where are we going to get all these rubber stoppers? Where are we going to get the needles? You know, or do we have the capacity to inoculate 6 or 7 billion people? And it's one of those where, you know, 20 plus years in this space, and I had this one shining moment where, like, I know more than most people do. This is like the one thing where I'm like, oh
This
my
is my
God,
time.
yes, I'm finally the guy. I know this stuff. But yeah, it's weird. But when you try and talk to normal people about this and you explain all the things that need to come together, like you were saying, just to make a pencil, everything that comes together to do this, even what we're talking about now, I'm not sure when this one's going to air, but the vaccines that they're Operation Warp Speeding their way towards, the one that's in the lead at present comes from Pfizer, and that one needs to be stored at minus 94 degrees Fahrenheit,
That's chilly.
because it is a, yeah, and it's a technology that's never been used on a commercial scale. And it's not just how do you store it like that, how do you distribute it? How do you make
Hmm.
sure that everybody who's getting an injection is not getting one that was left out too long and
That's
is
a
losing
dud.
potency? Yep.
Yeah.
And that's it's all this stuff that goes into it, all these logistics and everything else. It's not just a case of how many doses can you make. And
Mm.
that's you know, early on, that's where things were when we talked to the feds over what CMOs can contribute to, you know, help us get through the pandemic. There was a lot of focus on number of doses, and my members were like, that's not a metric. You know, there are a lot of bottlenecks besides how many units can you throughput, you know, per minute. That's not,
Yeah.
you know, what ultimately dictates how much you can actually manufacture. So it's really become a learning curve for a lot of people. um, And this is an era where we've all become epidemiologists and virologists and everything else because we read Twitter. We now, somehow have decided we're all experts on subject X, Y, or Z.
Well, I mean, I
But
am.
yeah,
I don't know about you, but I am.
yes,
It's funny because you bringing that up. I mean, I'm up in the Boston area. I think. Are you down in Jersey? Is that right?
yeah, northern New Jersey.
Yes, New
Yeah.
Jersey. So I'm like 40 minutes away from the Pfizer facility, which I believe is doing the majority of the work on
Mhm.
on their vaccine. And I'm not far from Moderna. I know a ton of people
Yeah.
that's pretty well known, which I believe they're working with Lonza, which is right up the street from me as well.
Right.
And I know J&J is working with Catalent, Emergent. There's all these different, things happening right now.
Right.
So it's been pretty fascinating. And this, my Facebook and LinkedIn just lighting up with all these things and people and places that I've visited over the years. So it's pretty interesting to watch. And to your end, I mean, what I'm seeing is, J&J secures 1 billion doses. Like, how are they doing it? They're going to CMOs because J&J doesn't just have a factory sitting there waiting to make a product that they've never thought of before, right?
Yeah.
And they're going to, I don't know, are they Catalenta or somebody like that?
Yeah.
Who happens
They've
to
got a
have,
few. Same thing. They've got, I think they're Catalent, AMRI, and somebody else. And even that stuff, some of it is just the fill finish.
yeah,
Some of it is the bulk manufacturing for the adenovirus stuff that they're using. There's a lot of, again, when people say manufacturing, they don't really get, like we
yeah,
do, how many
yeah,
things, how many different types of manufacturing there are and everything that
yeah.
has to come together.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I think it's given the world, in some ways, a chance to see into our world, which I think is probably valuable. In another way, it's kind of a not realistic view into our world because the way this has gone down is not. I mean, it's
No.
completely atypical, right? I mean, when has this ever
Yeah.
happened before? So I guess I want to turn just a little bit to get a little bit better
Sure.
understanding on PBOA and in what you're doing for your members, so that
Sure.
it's maybe you guys, you're probably operating at a level that's above where I'm at.
Oh,
You mentioned like
it's okay. Yeah,
GDUFAs, I
there's a
think, at the
lot of different
beginning.
aspects of it. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, the whole thing was, as I said, GDUFA was the flashpoint to bring us together. That was the user fees that were negotiated without CMO involved, and all those user fees at FDA. And there's one for prescription drugs, one for medical devices, one for biosimilars, as well as this generic one, and two for animal drugs also. All of those user fees get renewed every 5 years. They have to be negotiated between industry and FDA, and then they get ratified by Congress into a statute, and the White House or the president signs off on it, and you get another 5 years of user fees going to the FDA. So we came into existence about a year before GDUFA 2 was going to be negotiated, and we convinced FDA to bring us to the table and became part of the negotiations for that new GDUFA. And a lot of the user fee issues are less about the dollar amounts and much more about processes and procedures and ways to improve the review process for different types of drug applications. Those are things that aren't directly impacting CMOs, but I sat through every one of those meetings. I got up at 4 o'clock in the morning once every week or two to drive to Newark, get the train down to Maryland so I could go to the FDA for 5 or 6 hours, turn around, go back and get home that night. Um,
there's a
it's
hotel for things like that, FYI.
yeah, I just don't sleep great the first night, and it's one of those, if it's going to be that bad, I may as well just get up and leave the house in the morning anyway. And I discovered that it's easier driving into Newark at 5 o'clock in the morning instead of
Oh
during the
yeah,
workday. But the thing that we discovered was a lot of people didn't know how CMOs work. They didn't understand the economic models, the timelines, what it's like managing multiple customers the way CMOs do. And that was both our industry counterparts and FDA. So over the course of about 10 months of GDUFA negotiations, we really helped raise the profile within those areas about what CMOs do and how we work together, how we work with industry. And from there, FDA began to bring us into other meetings and other areas of interest they had, like serialization, quality metrics, and things like that they're developing. They wanted to make sure CMOs were now represented instead of just I refer to them as the license holder. when people say drug manufacturer, they don't necessarily mean the manufacturing site,
Right,
which is what
right.
I'm
They
focused on.
mean
So
the logo that's on a label, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I go with license holder for that, weird semantic differentiation. Um, so they brought us into those sorts of meetings so we could, give them a fuller of what the sector is doing in these various spaces. And in addition, the generic industry that we worked with on GDUFA really came to appreciate our role and our set of interests much better. They understood that our margins weren't the same as theirs, even as their margins are nowhere near what, innovator pharma and biopharma are like. So they got a greater understanding of who we were and just a sense that they could now reach out to us, that we were there to talk through these things and be able to talk about issues going forward.
Mm.
Similarly, through those other meetings with FDA, we started to interact more with pharma and bio, and they came to appreciate our presence more because they now understood for manufacturing related issues, we've been through a lot. We've handled every customer up and down the scale, from the biggest companies down to the virtual guys who are, two dudes in a garage who have a molecule and are trying to figure out how to make more. We've covered everything as a sector. Yeah, it's I hear stories from my members as to what some of the customers show up with, and it's we have a beaker of this, can you make more of this, and that's basically all they have to go with. So yeah, we really from there, built not just facing out towards the rest of industry and to FDA, but we also got members to talk to each other. And we started building working groups, our quality technical group, our serialization group, things that allowed our members to start not just sharing best practices, but asking questions.
Mm.
And there are all these companies, in certain respects, operate in silos.
Yeah.
You're at company X, you know how company X does it, but you don't know how company Y a few miles away does it. And they really found a lot of good, things that they could ask about, things that weren't proprietary, things that aren't, I always have to say, in a non-antitrust violating, non-collusive way. They found things they could talk about that really, gave value to both sides. They started to understand, oh, if you have problem X, just ask the quality group because somebody there has run into this problem before. Similarly, they can also start sharing, you know, inspectors have been asking for this sort of document lately. Have you guys been seeing that? And a few of them will either chime in with, yeah, we're starting to see the same thing, or they'll, oh, we haven't been inspected for a little while. We better make sure we have this sort of documentation ready in case FDA asks us for it too.
Mm.
So just being able to talk and being able to share things has been a great benefit. We started a trade show not a trade show, a conference a few years ago, with the idea that as far as events go in our industry, the CMOs are usually the guys at the booth, handing out literature, holding meetings, doing business development. And I told them, I'd love to do a show where you're the guest, where
Mm.
you are there to be in the audience. You're there to network. You're not there to sell. Don't send your BD guys necessarily. Send quality, send C-level, send other people who don't get to go to shows. They're going to meet with FDA. They're going to meet with their peers, do a great dinner. We started going to this Jose Andres restaurant near where we do the show. And they really appreciate that too, that sense of having a place of their own,
Mm-hmm.
being able to meet with each other. And they know that there are enough trade shows out there in the before time when we actually had trade shows. There are enough trade shows out
BC,
there where
yeah,
they could go to do
BC.
business. Yeah, I just got asked this morning, what are my members thinking about trade shows this spring?
Yeah,
And I asked them, I'm like, anything? They said nothing in Q1. Maybe we start going as
yeah,
second quarter, depending on progress with the vaccine. But yeah, it's amazing to me how different the world got as quickly as it did.
yeah.
But anyway, that's part of what we do for our guys.
I don't know if you've, I don't know if you would have seen, but this week as we're doing this recording, I'm normally at a big trade show that takes place up in the Boston area, and last year we had about 4,000 people at it, and I've been one of the chairs of the show for the last few years, but we didn't have it this
It's a
year.
BPI show.
This is
Is it
the ISPE show.
Oh, okay, good.
So,
Yeah.
and we have it at Gillette Stadium. So anyways, we're doing something in its place, a virtual thing, but it's not the same as having 4,000 people at the same spot, all
Yeah.
having fun together and getting to see each other. So I feel that pain as I prepare for next year and going, okay, are we going to be able to do this in September next year, or what? It's hard. It's hard to plan anything, right?
Yeah. I mean, DCAT moved to July. They're usually like March, early April in New
Yeah.
York, and they're doing like mid-July, which we'll
What
hope, you know.
Interfex would be similar, right? Interfex is another big one
Yeah,
in New York.
they're end of April, and that's another one that, I'm hoping, and they're an affiliate member of the association, as a matter
Yeah.
of fact. I'm hoping that one that we feel safe. I'll put it this way: last year, early this year, when the Jacob Javits Center was being converted into a hospital
Yeah.
for everyone, the idea that we would even be thinking of a trade show by beginning of 21,
Yeah.
so we've made progress. At the same time, we're in stasis. It's a weird trip we're in. So.
All right. So I have a question written down here. We've probably spoken to it, but I thought it would be interesting to hear
Sure.
maybe specifically. And it's, when I was on your website, this is one of your mission statements is to advance the common industry goals and interests. And so I guess I'm interested in, maybe an example of what that looks like. One of those goals or interests that you've been able to, as an association, sort of move something forward that, tangibly.
Sure. The way I like to frame it is we advocate for the regulatory, legislative, and general business interests of the sector. And regulatory, that GDUFA is certainly number one. That was our
Yeah.
proof of concept. We came through that negotiation. We negotiated a far better deal for CMOs. They pay far less in that program than they did before. That we started with 15 members. Within another year, we'd almost doubled it because a lot of CMOs suddenly saw, oh, okay, this worked. You actually saved me, X amount of money. This is something that we believe in, that you can actually get us good results. From there, we started working with Congress immediately after, because after we finished GDUFA, you then have to get it through Congress, make sure they don't change anything, and get it through to the White House. And from there, we really started to get involved in things like the opioid omnibus. Again, the drug shortages concept, we haven't been able to get enough traction with, but we've been able to get in front of like congressional staff and the right people to explain, like I said, with onshoring, what manufacturing is, why you don't want to make a knee-jerk reaction about certain things, great incentives instead of mandates. Why you want to make sure there's a reason for people to go there, not a penalty not to. So they've seen that. We do a monthly legislative update call with the advocacy firm we use in Washington, and it's free for our members. They can call in, listen to what's going on the Hill, but also ask questions about areas of interest for them. And especially in the COVID era, there's been a lot of moving parts, a lot of things they're concerned with, that they want to make sure that Congress isn't overlooking or accidentally miscategorizing, again, in terms of calling everybody a manufacturer and accidentally
Yeah.
burdening the CMO sector. We've seen results like that. During the end of GDUFA, when the FDA Reauthorization Act was getting voted on, there were amendments that would have been incredibly damaging to the CMO sector that our advocacy firm found for us, and we were able to mobilize a couple of key CMOs who were in certain important states and get these amendments taken out because they would have been bad, frankly.
I'm
Yeah.
curious, do you find that some of that, I know how laws work in industry. Do you find that it's more of just an ignorance of how things work from a lawmaking standpoint, or is it, maybe there's some lobbying organization that's really pushing and counting on their ignorance, I guess.
I'll tell you, my primary thing, I went into this entire phase of my life with the assumption that anything that was negative towards CMOs was somehow done with malicious intent.
Yeah.
And it took me a while to realize, you just didn't know.
Yeah.
So many things. I don't want to say ignorance as a pejorative term.
And
but
I'm not meaning
just,
it that way. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I just mean they were ignorant of the CMO sector and how it works and what it does, and it's just, that absence of knowledge. So going out there and educating people has really helped us. In one area, we did this with a different user fee that's, God, finally going to come to life soon. Over-the-counter monograph user fee. I actually ended up testifying in front of a congressional subcommittee over that, which was an interesting experience.
Hmm.
But in that case, a fee was again negotiated without CMOs, and FDA and industry finalized it and were headed towards Congress with it. And we actually reached out to Congress and told them, we laid out what was wrong, why my members were going to get penalized, what we do for the OTC world and for pharma overall. And they pushed back. Congress came back and said, yeah, you guys got hosed here. We're going to go tell FDA they need to start working with you to fix this before we consider it as law. And that really, I know we live in a cynical world where, money, all that stuff, but honestly, this was an instance where, our work was really guided just by the justness of our cause. Like, they heard what we had to say and were like, yeah, you guys are important. You are getting hosed. We're going to help and make sure that you at least get an opportunity to fix things. And we did. We went into a renegotiation with the other industry group, got a more equitable deal, and the bill sat for like 2 years with nothing happening, maybe more than 2 years. And then in the CARES bill, the coronavirus relief package in like April or May, it showed up out of the blue. Like, the thing showed up by PDF. I go searching for anything Pharma. I'm like, the over-the-counter monograph, how did that get in? Whatever, it's there, it's fine. We're glad they finally got it in, but that's a weird thing to shoehorn into to COVID relief, but whatever.
I mean, I'm sure there was far more weird things that got shoehorned into that
Oh
bill
yeah.
than something having to do with pharma. It's a pretty interesting, I guess, even lesson, I guess, in your world to learn. And it reminds me of when I think it was like Zuckerberg was being interviewed in front of Congress, and people are asking questions. He's like, "So the internet's like a pipe, and stuff goes down the pipe." I'm like, these guys really, I mean, technically they have such a purview of responsibility. They
Yeah.
can't know everything, but to understand the complexities of supply chain and how manufacturing organizations operate, there's just too many things to know. So it's neat to
I'll
know that
put it
it
this
isn't
way.
all mean people.
We talk yeah, we talk to staff generally.
Yeah.
There's very few cases where we talk directly to the representatives. Now there are individuals who have some knowledge of this stuff. There's some interesting ones. A representative from Oklahoma who his family business was like plumbing supply components, but at least he understood what manufacturing tolerances were like, and he got what we do as pharma. His staff was able to get him up to speed. The other great one that I always tell people about, Representative Buddy Carter from Georgia. He is a former pharmacist and has a lot of interest in how pharmaceuticals, how we do manufacturing, distribution, et cetera,
Yeah.
especially headed more towards the patient side of things. First time I met with his healthcare staffer, I started explaining PBOA, who we are, what we do. And then I said to her, actually, let's go back. The first thing is, please note, PBOA and its members have nothing to do with drug prices.
Mm.
Because I've seen your boss shout at people during hearings about prices, rebates, all that stuff. And I don't want him to shout at me. So I said, just, understand, I'm glad he cares about pharma. Our part of pharma has nothing to do with, the prices that get attached to things at the end and reimbursement. So she's like, oh, thank you. And I wrote that down at the top of the page. I'm like,
Don't yell at Jill.
But you have to learn some of those personalities. That's been interesting. Just again, I was a total neophyte to this stuff. It was really, I had a little bit of exposure 2015 and 16, but with 2017, when we finished GDUFA and were then going to the Hill to sell it, as it were, that's when I started to learn much more about how Congress works, how you talk to how you explain things to staff in ways that are clear, get across, the value that your members have, the role they play in certain congressional districts or states.
Mm-hmm.
And my whole thing, I may be shooting myself in the foot, but I'm some guy from New Jersey. I'm not a wheel dealer in Washington. I'm just trying to represent this sector that's historically been underrepresented, and just make sure they're getting a fair deal. So,
Yeah. Well,
yeah,
I mean, it's certainly needed. And I think the understanding of this space is, I think it's gone up like we talked about in the last 6 months, but there's so much more to it. People talk about drug prices, and I've worked on the manufacturing side for a number of years now. You're like, well, if you went into one of these facilities and saw how they need to make these drugs, you might start understanding why they're so expensive.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
even talking about, stoppers for, vials and that stopper, it's not like just a regular old stopper, it has to have all kinds of documentation that goes with it. And, you need to know where it traveled from, where it
it's,
came from, where they got the material from. I mean, it's just
yep,
not the same. So
yep.
it's hard to understand how big of a deal every little piece in this space is, for sure.
One of our affiliate members in Japan, Namikos, one of their big services is vial washing,
Hmm.
and they've they've done vial washing for drug companies on the other side of the planet. They've shipped the vials to Japan just to be cleaned by these guys and shipped back for clinical trials, elsewhere in the world. And it's one of those things when you realize, whatever drug they're making is worth a lot more than whatever they're spending to make sure they're getting the very best cleaning services they can possibly get for these things. So,
To think that you're shipping something to the other side of the planet to wash it
I know
for a
when they
dishwasher.
first told me about that, I'm like, wow,
I mean,
that's,
it's a glorified dishwasher. I mean, it's a really
yeah,
special dish. I used to sell them, actually.
yeah,
So it's a big, really fancy dishwasher. So
yeah. And
wow.
they're amazing at it, but that's when it's one of those things where the value stuff is so great that's not a huge cost where it comes to R&D. But it's also that I try and explain within the sector, and when we're facing out at people, and you see the same thing, I'm sure. This is a relationship business. If you trust that guy at Namikos, and they're the guys who can do this and they've done it right before, you will keep going back, because
Mm,
reputation really, really holds a lot of weight in this space. And it's the same with those. You want to go with guys, guys who deliver. When I started out with Contract Pharma, when we launched it in '99, within a couple of years, I started doing an outsourcing survey. In years, basically the number one factor people would cite for choosing different CMOs was cost. And over time, that changed towards quality and timeliness of delivery and things like that. And there's some degree to which people lie about these things. It's like
mhm.
the Brady effect, where everybody would say PBS was incredibly important, but nobody actually watches PBS.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, there was a sense where they're like, yeah, cost is one thing, but if we're getting it cheap and we have to send back a third of the batches, it's not really worthwhile. We want to make sure it's people we trust and people who we know can deliver. So
Yeah.
the industry's changed in that respect for sure.
Yeah. Well, I've seen the same thing. Reputation goes a long way. It's kind of no matter what they fill out on the survey,
Right.
there's a lot
Yeah.
there on their decision matrix. So, anyways, Gil, this has been fascinating. This is a world that's, again, a little bit above my head, a little bit above my pay grade. But I
Mine
really,
too, back in 2014.
yeah, but that's okay, right? But I interact with a lot of your members. I mean, I interact with them pretty regularly, and I'm fascinated by what they're doing and what their capacity is and how fast they're able to respond to the market. So it's been really cool to learn about that. What I want to do before we close out, who are the people that you want to talk to at these companies? So like, to me, it seems like you want to talk to all like C-level kind of people, but is there like layers within the organization that you're working with regularly?
Well, it varies. Coming out of Contract Pharma, I was dealing primarily with B&D and sales and marketing people. And over time, that did start moving up more towards a C level or lead. And one of the things that really has held up as a few years have gone by now is, once you have that initial contact, once you get the yes, it's more important that you develop multiple points of contact within these companies. And those working groups and committees I mentioned are really important for that.
Mm,
Once company X joins, you make sure their quality people are participating, their IT and labeling people are part of the serialization group, that other portions get involved. So that way they start to see a greater value for being part of PBOA, because it is one of the weird aspects, one of the truisms of the industry is just the amount of turnover
yeah.
within staff, but also, and this is a stat that only came up a couple of years ago and scared me when I saw it. When we began in 2014, there were 12 founding member companies. There were also 3 general members, but we'll just go with those initial 12. By the middle of 2018, 7 of them had been acquired, and an 8th was going to be acquired, but it fell through.
Mm,
2 others had been bought within 3 years before then. So that's an industry with some serious turnover. We had almost 2/3 of our founding members acquired either, from one private equity to another, or swallowed up into a larger CMO. And that's when that happens, you need to go back in and explain to everyone why they're part of PBOA, because there's new management now, and this is part of the value of being here. For my part, I think all of those companies stayed on board under their new incarnations. But it's, it creates a challenge, but it's also just part of how the CMO industry works, especially given that so much of it is driven by private equity as opposed to publicly held companies the way large pharma is.
mm-hmm. Yeah. So, okay. That makes sense. I don't fully understand all those different working groups. I operate more in the engineering space, I guess, of most
Yeah.
organizations. So do you cover lots of layers within organizations, or maybe
We
just a
try,
few?
yeah. And the quality group really helps. Quality is a very broad term,
Yeah.
and you can get people in from different areas. Even serialization, where it's about the labeling and track and trace stuff that's done, when we started a serialization group, I started looking at the titles of the members who were participating in it. And it varied from guys who were involved in the engineering, because it involved bringing in this equipment, getting it to work, getting these new labels on, making sure they had the correct barcodes, to the IT guys who, yes, in a sense, it's engineering also, but they're not equipment people. They're working in
Right.
a software world. And we saw people from both of those sides, as well as some of the quality people wanting to do double duty and get involved in the serialization thing, just because at CMOs, sometimes the people wear multiple hats, as I'm sure
Mm-hmm.
you've encountered
Yeah.
also, and the smaller the CMO, especially, there's guys who have about 5 different jobs, and you just try to figure out which one's appropriate at any given time. So,
Yeah. They seem to operate at a higher speed than your typical licensed.
yeah.
How did you refer to them? Your licensed manufacturers?
Yeah, the license holders. Yeah.
The
Yeah.
license holders, those manufacturing facilities don't operate the same speed as these CMOs. They're at all the way to the wall the whole time.
Yeah.
So
Right.
awesome. Well, hey, how would somebody get a hold of you? What's the best way to get a hold of you, your organization, or you directly?
You can go through our website, which is pharma-bio.org. I'm on Twitter as PBOA SSOC for PBOA Association. You can look me up on LinkedIn as Gil Roth. If you post this episode with some contact links,
Yep.
I'll send you those. So, but yeah, there's a couple of different ways. And if this goes up before CPHI's Festival of Pharma, I'll be speaking on the future of drug manufacturing, where I apologize if I say some of the same things that I've said during this podcast, but I just finished writing a chunk of the script earlier today. So I had a lot of that stuff in my head.
Awesome. Well, it was nice and fresh. That's what we wanted. Good new content. So, all right. Yeah. I'll put all those notes in the episode notes for sure, that people can link to. This will ultimately get put up on LinkedIn too. So you'll get tagged and all that. I'm not much of a Twitter guy, but that's all right. I'm sure some people are.
It's healthier for you.
Is
Don't
it?
worry.
Okay. All right. Well, hey, Gil, thanks for being on today. I appreciate it, and look forward to seeing more from you in the future.
Awesome. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
All right.